bugle found him before his eyes had properly opened, 3 notes climbing out of the dark and hanging there over the barrack roofs. The Rouse, thin and a little cracked at the top, the way it always was when the bugler had not yet cleared his throat for the day. Private Thomas Whitlow lay still a moment beneath his mosquito net, feeling the last of the night's cool on his bare arms, knowing it would not last. Somewhere down the row of iron cots a man groaned and turned over, chains creaking, and Alf Deacon in the next bed swore softly and without heat, the way men swear at nothing in particular, only at the hour. Tom lifted the net aside and swung his legs down onto the stone floor, and the floor was warm already, warm as a hearth that had banked its fire overnight rather than let it go out. And he understood, without needing to think about it, that this was going to be one of the hot ones. He had learned, in his 3 years out, to read the coming day off the floor before he had even looked at the window. A cool floor meant a bearable morning. A warm floor at this hour, with the sky still more gray than gold through the shutters, meant the punkah would be going by 9 and the whole battalion would be moving like men wading through water by noon. He sat for a moment on the edge of the cot, elbows on his knees, and let the room come up around him the way it always did, familiar as his own hands. The long white room ran the length of the block, a double row of cots down either wall, each with its net gathered up now like a bride's veil pushed back, each with its black tin box at the foot, holding a man's whole life reduced to what would fit in 2 feet of tin. The walls were whitewashed, and had been whitewashed so many times that the corners had gone soft and rounded, no sharp edges left anywhere. And along the top of the walls, up near the roof beams, the old stains of 100 hot seasons showed through the lime like watermarks on old paper. The veranda beyond the open doors was already pale with the coming light, and out past the veranda the Maidan lay flat and colorless, waiting. Reveille went perhaps a quarter of an hour later, brisker than the Rouse, more insistent, the notes bright enough to carry across the whole cantonment, over the sergeant's mess and the married quarters and the dark bulk of the regimental stores sleeping behind their own high wall, out towards the lines where the Indian regiment's bugles would already be answering, a call taken up and passed along the whole waking station like a word repeated down a long table. By then Tom was up and moving, because a man learned quickly enough that the 10 minutes before Reveille were worth having, and the 10 minutes after it were not. Not with Corporal Hook's voice likely to come round the door asking why a certain private thought himself exempt from soldiering that morning. He pulled on his shirt and his khaki drill trousers, the cloth still faintly damp from yesterday's sweat, because nothing dried all the way through in this season, not really, not even hung all night under the veranda eaves. His feet found his boots by habit alone in the half-light. Around him the room had come fully awake now, men pulling on braces, men swearing mildly at boots that would not go on the first attempt. Somebody down by the far door already whistling a music hall tune under his breath, flat and cheerful, and entirely without tune. Alf sat on the edge of his own cot, lacing up with the concentrated frown of a man doing sums, and without looking up, he said, "Gunfire'll taste of dust again. Mark me." "It always tastes of dust," Tom said. "It's the water. Nothing to be done for it." "I could be done for it," Alf said, "if somebody would only agree to fetch it from somewhere that isn't dust." Outside, low over the flagstaff a mile off across the parade ground, the sky had gone the color of a duck egg, pale and faintly blue-green, with no fierceness in it yet, though Tom knew that innocence for what it was. By 7, it would be a white sky, glaring, and by 10, it would have no color at all, only heat standing in the air like something you could lean against. He liked this hour best of all the hours in his day, liked it the way a man likes the moment before a meal, when the appetite is sharp and nothing has yet gone wrong. The camp smelled at this hour of wood smoke from the cook-house fires just catching, and of the damp, beaten earth of the Maidan where the water cart had gone over it the evening before to keep the dust down, and underneath all of it, always, the particular sweetish smell of the country itself, dust and dung smoke, and some flowering thing he had never troubled to learn the name of, a smell that had become so much the smell of being alive to him now that he no longer noticed it, except in memory, thinking backward to Warwickshire, to a smell of wet hedgerows that seemed now almost to belong to somebody else's life. Men were filing out onto the veranda, and from along the row a call went up, not a bugle this time, but a human voice, high and carrying, a boy's voice, and behind it the small percussive rattle of brass against brass, the char-wallah's kit coming down the lines. Ramzan Khan came along the veranda the way he came every single morning of the year, barefoot, quick, a wooden yoke across his shoulders, with a great blackened kettle swinging from one end and a stack of small clay cups threaded on a string from the other, and he called his tea the way he had called it for as long as any man in the battalion could remember, serving here a long rising cry that every soldier in India had heard so many times it had stopped being words and become only a sound that meant morning. Chai, chai, garam, chai. And then, seeing Tom in the English he had picked up in fragments over years of selling to this same battalion. Good morning, Whitlow Sahib. Hot today. Hotter than yesterday, I think. You said that yesterday and all, Tom said, holding out his cup, one of the battalion's own tin mugs, rather than Ramzan's clay ones, because he liked his tea in a mug he could hold without burning his fingers. Yesterday, I was right also. Ramzan poured in one long, unbroken stream, no spill, the tea coming out black and sweet and scalding, and there was something in the economy of the movement, the total lack of waste in it, that Tom had come to admire without ever quite putting the admiration into words. 3 years of watching the man pour, and he had never once seen him spill a drop, not even in the scramble of a full barrack room turning out at once, 40 men wanting their gunfire in the same 5 minutes. You will drink it now, or you will carry it to parade and lose half over your boots, same as always. I'll drink it now, Tom said, and did, standing on the veranda with the tin mug scalding his palms pleasantly through the thinning morning cool, the tea tasting exactly as Alf had promised, of dust and sugar and the particular charcoal bitterness that Ramzan's kettle always gave it, and somehow none the worse for any of that. It was called gunfire because somewhere across the cantonment at the main station a few miles off where the artillery lay, the morning gun would be going off about now, the flag climbing the staff there to mark the day's official start, though out here at the infantry lines a man knew the hour by the tea and the bugle and the whitening sky, rather than by any gun he could hear. Ramzan moved on down the veranda with his yoke swaying, calling his cry again for the next barrack room, and Tom finished his tea and went back in to see to his kit, because parade would not wait on any man's tea, however good, and Corporal Hook had a way of appearing in doorways at the precise moment a man least wanted him to. The room was busy now in the particular unhurried hurry of 40 men doing the same thing at once, familiar as breathing. Tom took down his rifle from the rack at the head of his cot, felt the cool of the metal that had not yet caught the day's heat, checked it over out of pure habit rather than need, since he had cleaned it the evening before until the barrel would have satisfied a colonel's white glove, and found it exactly as he had left it, oiled and quiet and unloaded, a tool with no more meaning to him this morning than a spade would have had. He racked it again and reached instead for his belt and pouches, buckling up while Alf beside him complained gently to nobody about the state of his own bootlaces, and around them the room emptied out onto the veranda and down the steps and across the Maidan in twos and threes, the whole barrack block converging toward the parade ground, the way water finds its way downhill without needing to be told the route. Outside, the light had strengthened enough to throw the flagstaff's shadow long and thin across the beaten earth, and the battalion was assembling company by company, the companies finding their ground with the ease of long practice, no shouting needed yet, only the low murmur of several hundred men settling themselves into ordered lines, while the sky went from duck-egg blue to the first hard white of the day. Sergeant Major Cobb's voice would carry over it all soon enough, and the drill would begin. But for this one suspended minute, boots not yet stamped into stillness, the whole parade ground held its breath together, waiting for the day to properly start. The drill itself was nothing Tom's body needed his mind for any longer. Form fours, right wheel, order arms, the whole long grammar of it worn so smooth by repetition that he could stand in the ranks and let his thoughts wander half a world away, while his boots and his shoulders did precisely what 3 years of mornings had taught them, arriving at each position a half-second before the word of command finished leaving the sergeant major's mouth, the whole company moving as one broad single creature rather than 80 separate men. The point of doing it now, in the raw hour after Reveille, was only ever to have it done before the sun came properly up, because by 9 the ground would throw back enough heat through a man's boot soles to make him feel he was drilling on a griddle, and the officers knew that as well as any private did. They wheeled and formed and dressed their ranks under a sky still merciful enough to be called morning, the band's drummer keeping a light tap, tap, tap that was more habit than music, and Tom found a kind of pleasure in it that he had never expected to find when he first joined, a pleasure in the sheer correctness of it, in 100 men's boots striking the earth at exactly the same instant, a single flat crack rather than 100 small ones. There was no urgency in the sound. There never was. It was drill for its own sake, an exercise the body performed to keep the body ready, though ready for what exactly Tom had stopped asking himself long ago. The readiness had become its own justification, a discipline that existed the way a scale exists for a man who plays the piano, practiced without expectation that it would ever be called upon for anything grander than itself. Corporal Hook walked the ranks afterward with his hands behind his back, pausing here and there to tell a man his top button was adrift or his puttee had slipped, and stopped in front of Tom only long enough to say, not unkindly, "Whitlow, you're moving as if you've somewhere better to be." "No, Corporal," Tom said, "only somewhere later." "Same thing most days," Hook said, and moved on. And that was the whole of it. No heat in the exchange at all, only the small worn banter of men who had stood in the same lines together so many mornings that criticism and comradeship had become nearly the same language. By the time they were dismissed, The sun had cleared the cookhouse roofs properly, and the light had gone from gold to white, and the whole company broke formation and drifted back across the Maidan toward the lines with the loose, unhurried walk of men whose morning's real work, such as it was, had already been done. The cookhouse call went up as they came in sight of the barracks, that particular tumbling run of notes that every soldier in the army, Tom supposed, learned to sing words to before he had been in a fortnight, and along the verandas men were already taking it up under their breath, half a joke and half a genuine expression of the same plain appetite. "Oh, come to the cookhouse door, boys, come to the cookhouse door," sung flat and cheerful by men whose morning drill had left them properly hungry. The orderly men from each room were already moving toward the cookhouse, with the room's mess tins and the room's chosen portion of bad temper about the walk. Since the duty rotated, and no man much liked drawing it, though it was no great burden, only a matter of standing in a queue at the long counter while the cooks ladled out bread and tea and whatever the morning's ration happened to be. Today, a thin porridge and slices of bread with a scrape of ghee, and carrying the whole lot back balanced on a tray without spilling it across the Maidan, which was its own small trial of a morning. Tom had drawn the duty himself the week before, and had not enjoyed it especially, though there was a kind of satisfaction in being useful to the room in this small, unglamorous way, the same satisfaction he supposed that a man might take from carrying water for his own family table. This morning it was young Pretty's turn, and he came back red in the face from the heat of the cookhouse ovens, with the tray held out before him like a man carrying something that might go off. And the room settled onto the veranda steps and along the low wall to eat, because no man wanted to eat indoors an hour past Reveille when the outdoors was still relatively bearable. Tom took his bread and his tin of tea and sat with Alf on the veranda edge, watching the Maidan come alive with the ordinary business of the cantonment's morning, Dobus already at work down by the tank with their washings spread out to bleach on the grass, a string of mules going by under a syce's idle direction, somewhere off toward the officers' lines a dog barking at nothing with the flat persistence of a dog that has decided barking is simply what mornings are for. "Bread's good today," Alf said, which was Alf's highest form of praise for any meal, and largely accurate. The bread came from the regimental bakery and was a good deal better than the biscuit some of the older hands still complained about from years past, when the ovens had not yet been properly set up out here, and men had eaten ship's biscuit softened in tea for want of anything better. "It's always good on the days you're hungry enough not to notice," Tom said, though in truth he agreed with him. The bread was decent, plain, a little dense, exactly the sort of thing a man wanted after an hour's drill on an empty stomach, no more and no less than that. They ate without hurrying, because the morning, having given up its drill, now had nothing further scheduled for a while beyond Kit, and Kit was a thing a man did at his own pace provided it got done by inspection. When the tea was finished, Tom carried his own mug and Alf's back to the cookhouse trestle. And then there was the whole long familiar business of the kit itself to see to, the endless daily maintenance that ate up so much of a soldier's day out here that Tom sometimes thought the army had invented it less for readiness than simply to give idle hands something to occupy them, though he never said so aloud, since some sergeants took a very particular pride in a well-blancoed strap, and did not care to hear the exercise questioned. He laid his webbing out along the cot, and set to it with the blanco block and a dampened brush, working the pale khaki paste into the canvas until it took on that even chalky finish the inspecting officers like to see. No streaks, no patches left dark where the old color showed through. It was slow, careful, entirely undemanding work, the kind that let a man's thoughts drift while his hands went on without him. And Tom found himself thinking, as he often did over this particular chore, of his mother's kitchen table back in Warwickshire, of the smell of blacking on his father's boots of a Sunday, a smell not unlike this one though sharper, and of how strange it was that a man could travel 4,000 miles and still find his hands doing something that called up so exactly a kitchen he had not stood in for 3 years. Beside him, Alf worked at his own webbing with considerably less patience, muttering about the heat, which was climbing now in earnest. The white sky pressing down over the Maidan with a weight that had nothing to do with cloud, only with the sun's own directness at this latitude, a heat that did not build gradually the way an English summers did, but simply arrived, whole and entire, sometime between 8 and 9 each morning, and stayed unaltered until evening finally consented to take a little of it away. The buttons came next, small brass discs that Tom polished with a cloth and a smear of soldier's friend until they threw back the light hard enough to be seen from the far end of a barrack room. And then the boots, already black, but wanting a fresh coat, worked in with a bone and buffed until the toe caps held a dull mirror shine. And by the time he had finished the whole slow round of it, the sun stood high enough that the veranda's shade had shrunk to a narrow strip along the wall, and a man crossing the open Maidan now did so at something close to a trot, not from any urgency, but only because the ground itself had grown too hot to linger on. Down by the tank, the dobies were still at their washing, and Tom, carrying his own small bundle of shirts across to add to the week's load, found Bishen Singh exactly where he always found him this time of the morning, up to his knees in the shallow water, with a soldier's shirt gripped in both hands, swinging it up and cracking it down against the flat washing stone with a single practice stroke that seemed to do more work in that one motion than Tom's own scrubbing ever managed in 10. The sound of it, that flat, wet crack repeated down the line of dobies at their stones, had become one of the fixed sounds of the cantonment morning, as regular in its way as the bugle. "More shirts, Whitlow Sahib," Bishen Singh said without looking up, not a question, only an observation, and held out one hand for the bundle while the other kept working the shirt already in his grip. "You are a hard man on collars. Always the collar goes first with you." "That's my neck's fault, not yours," Tom said. "Too much sun on it." "Too much sun on all of you," Bishen Singh agreed, cheerfully enough, wringing the shirt out in one long twist and laying it flat on the grass beside a dozen others already spread there, whitening in the glare. "I have been doing this work 20 years, and I have never once seen an Englishman's neck that liked this country's sun. You should wear your topi lower." "I'll tell the colonel you said so." "Tell him. He will not listen to me either." Bishen Singh laughed, a short, easy sound, and took Tom's bundle from him and set it down with the others waiting their turn at the stone, and Tom left him to it and walked back up toward the barracks with the sun now fully overhead and the whole cantonment settling visibly into the stillness that the middle of the day always brought. Dogs gone quiet, birds gone quiet, even the mules down by the lines standing with their heads low as though the heat itself were a weight laid across their necks, There was an hour or so of light fatigue duty before dinner, nothing that troubled a man greatly. Sweeping out the barrack room and carrying fresh straw for the cot frames, and seeing that the veranda was clear of the small drifting rubbish that a hot wind always brought with it, dust and dry leaves, and once, memorably, an entire section of somebody's newspaper that had traveled who knew how far to come to rest against the barrack steps. Tom did his share of it without complaint, because complaint changed nothing about fatigue duty except a man's own mood while doing it, and because there was, if he was honest with himself, a kind of settling pleasure in physical work performed in company, brooms scraping in a loose rhythm along the stone floor, somebody singing under his breath. The whole room slowly restored to the bare, orderly emptiness that a barrack inspection liked to find. By the time the fatigue was done, the heat had gone from a presence to something closer to a fact of the world, immovable, total, the kind of heat that did not simply sit on the skin but seemed to get in behind a man's eyes and press there. The maidan beyond the veranda had lost all its morning color and lay white and shadowless under a sky gone the flat blank shade of old tin, and even the crows, which Tom had never in 3 years seen at a loss for something to complain about, had given up their morning racket and sat hunched and silent along the cookhouse roof with their beaks open. He had an hour free before dinner, and no strong wish to spend it lying on his cot, doing nothing, not yet, not with the whole slow afternoon still ahead of him for exactly that. And so he walked, unhurried, keeping to what shade the barrack blocks threw, down toward the regimental canteen, where a man could sit under a wide thatched roof with a mug of thin beer and pass half an hour in the sort of talk that went nowhere in particular and asked nothing of anybody, which suited him. Alf came along, as he generally did, complaining gently the whole way about the distance, though the canteen was not 200 yards off. The canteen at this hour held perhaps a dozen men scattered at the long trestle tables, some playing cards with the particular slow concentration of men who have played the same game 10,000 times and no longer need to think about it, others simply sitting with their beer, saying little, letting the punkah overhead do what work it could against the heat. The punkah here was a broad strip of canvas stretched on a wooden frame, slung the length of the room from the roof beam, and out on the veranda, where a rope ran through a hole cut in the wall, Iqbal sat cross-legged in the strip of shade, pulling the rope with one bare foot hooked through a loop at its end, leaving both his hands free for a game of his own. A scatter of small stones he was arranging and rearranging on the flagstones in some pattern Tom had never worked out the rules of. "Afternoon, Iqbal," Tom said, dropping onto the bench nearest the door where the little stirred air the punkah managed to raise would reach him soonest. "Afternoon, Whitlow Sahib." Iqbal did not look up from his stones, but the punkah's rhythm never faltered, his foot working the rope with the same unbroken patience it always had, hour after hour, through the whole worst stretch of the day. Tom had asked him once in his first hot season out how a man managed to keep at it so many hours without his mind wandering off the job entirely, and Iqbal had looked at him as if the question itself was slightly foolish, and said only that his foot knew the work now and did not need his mind's help with it, which struck Tom, turning it over afterward, as about the truest thing anybody had said to him regarding soldiering as well. The beer, when it came, was weak and a little warm, despite the canteen's best efforts at keeping the barrels cool, But Tom had long since stopped minding that. A man learned out here to want the beer less for its taste than for the 10 minutes pause it bought him, sitting still in whatever moving air was going, letting his shirt dry against his back for the length of a single mug before he had to be up and doing something again. Alf, beside him, had fallen into a card game with 2 men from another company, and Tom watched without joining, content simply to sit, the punkah's canvas swinging overhead with a soft, regular creak of rope against wood, a sound as steady and as unremarkable by now as his own pulse. Outside the canteen shade, the bazaar lane ran along the edge of the cantonment, where the town's traders had set up their stalls under awnings of woven matting, and Tom, finishing his beer, wandered that way before dinner, as he often did, not because he needed anything in particular, but because the lane offered a kind of variety the barrack lines never could, color and noise, and the small daily theater of trade. Prakash's stall halfway along was the one Tom stopped at most often, a low wooden counter piled with fruit brought in each morning from the gardens outside the cantonment wall, mangoes stacked in careful pyramids, a basket of small hard green limes, coils of some dried sweet Tom had never learned the English name for, and had stopped asking, since Prakash's own explanations, offered each time with slightly different embellishments, had become a kind of running joke between them, rather than anything either of them expected to be taken as fact. "Whitlow Sahib, you are early today," Prakash said, weighing a mango in one hand as though testing it against Tom's mood rather than its own ripeness. "Or you are simply hungrier than usual." "Bit of both," Tom admitted, and turned over a couple of the coins from his pocket, counting them against what he remembered a mango costing, though Prakash's prices moved a little from week to week in ways Tom had given up trying to track with any precision, trusting instead to the man's evident fairness, which 3 years of trade between them had never once given him cause to doubt. "This one," Prakash said, setting a particular mango aside from the pyramid, with the certainty of a man who had handled 10,000 mangoes and knew this one, this specific one, to be the best of the lot, "is for you. The others I would sell to anybody. This one I would only sell to a man I trust to enjoy it properly." "You say that to every soldier who comes past?" "I say it to every soldier whose money is good," Prakash said, and grinned, and Tom laughed and paid him, and took the mango, turning away down the lane with the fruit's sweet skin already faintly perfumed against his palm, a smell that belonged entirely to this place and no other, sharp and rich and a little like turpentine underneath the sweetness, nothing like any fruit Warwickshire had ever grown. Dinner, the day's main meal, came at midday in the cookhouse, the long room thick with the smell of boiled mutton and the particular starchy warmth of rice steaming in its pots, and the battalion filed through in company order to be served from the great black cauldrons that had simmered since early morning under the cook's unhurried attention. It was plain food, unvaried from one week to the next in any way that mattered, mutton stew, thickened with what vegetables the season allowed, potatoes more often than not, a ladle of rice, bread on the side, and Tom had eaten some version of this same meal so many hundreds of times now that he could have told, blindfolded, which day of the week it was by the particular balance of onion to meat in the pot. He did not mind it. A man out here learned, if he had any sense, not to mind the food, since minding it changed nothing except his own appetite, and the meal, however plain, however repetitive, was hot and filling, and came at the same hour every day of the world, which was its own kind of comfort, even if nobody would have called it a grand one. He sat with Alf and Pretty and 2 or 3 others from the room at the long trestle. The talk drifting the way barrack talk always drifted at this hour, nothing of any consequence, a disagreement about whether the cricket 11 ought to be reshuffled before Saturday's match against the Gunners, a rumor that the tombola prize this week was to be a clock rather than the usual few rupees, Pretty's opinion, offered at some length, on which of the 2 barbers in the bazaar gave the closer shave, an opinion nobody had asked for, and everybody let him finish anyway because the alternative was more heat and less talk. It was the kind of conversation that filled the ordinary hours of a soldier's life out here, small, circling, entirely without weight, and Tom found in it, as he generally did, a plain contentment that asked nothing more of the day than that it should go on being exactly what it already was. By the time dinner broke up, the heat outside had reached its full height, the Maidan gone white and hard under a sun that stood directly overhead with no mercy left in its angle at all, and the whole cantonment, Tom knew without needing to look, was folding itself indoors now, into whatever shade and whatever moving air it could find, to wait out the worst hours of the day the only way anybody out here had ever found to wait them out, lying still and letting the punkahs do what modest work they could. Back in the barrack room, the shutters had been drawn half across against the glare, and the long room lay in a kind of brown twilight, striped where the sun found its way between the slats, and every cot along both walls had a man stretched out on it now, some asleep already, some simply lying with an arm across their eyes, waiting for sleep to decide whether it wanted them. Overhead, the room's own punkah swung on its long rope, worked from outside by another man Tom had never learned the name of, a cousin of Iqbal's perhaps, or simply another of the punkah men from the same quarter of the bazaar who had taken up the same trade, and the cloth swept back and forth with a slow, heavy motion that stirred the thick air without ever quite cooling it, more a reminder that air could move at all than any real relief from the heat itself. Tom lay on his own cot with his shirt open and his boots off, and felt the sweat come up on his skin in a fine, even film the moment he stopped moving, the particular stillness sweat of the deep afternoon that no amount of lying quiet ever seemed to dry. Outside, past the half-drawn shutters, the cantonment had gone as silent as he had ever heard it. No bugle due for hours yet, no drill, no traffic on the Maidan beyond, perhaps a solitary bullock cart somewhere off toward the bazaar, its wheels creaking at long intervals, a sound that seemed to underline the stillness rather than break it. Even Alf, 2 cots along, had given up his usual commentary on the state of the world and lay with one arm flung across his face, breathing slow. This was the hour Tom had come, over 3 years, to think of as the true center of the day, not because anything happened in it, but precisely because nothing did. An hour, 2 hours, sometimes 3, in which the whole battalion simply lay down together and waited for the sun to move, the way he supposed cattle lay down together under a hedge in an English August, waiting out the worst of it, with nothing better to do and no better place to be. He did not mind it especially. A man could get used to almost anything given enough repetitions of it, and he had long since stopped expecting the afternoons to offer him anything beyond this, a slow, suspended stretch of time in which his own thoughts were the only company going. He thought, lying there with the punkah's shadow sweeping back and forth across the ceiling beams of home, as he often did in this particular hour, though the thinking had none of the sharp ache in it now that it had carried in his first year out, when every thought of Warwickshire had come edged with something close to grief. 3 years had worn the edge down to something gentler, a kind of fond and faintly sad remembering, his mother's kitchen, the smell of a coal fire on a wet evening, the sound of rain on a slate roof, a sound he found oddly that he missed more than he missed any person, more even than he missed his mother's voice, which had itself begun to blur a little in his memory, softened at the edges the way a photograph softens with handling. He did not write home every week, though he meant to, and told himself each time that he would do better the week following. Today, with nothing else asked of him and the whole afternoon stretching empty ahead, he thought he might manage it, and after a while, when the worst weight of the heat had eased very slightly, or perhaps only when he had grown tired of doing nothing at all, he got up and found his writing case in the bottom of his kit box, the paper gone a little soft and curled at the edges from the damp that got into everything out here, no matter how carefully a man packed it away. He sat on the edge of his cot with the paper balanced on the lid of the box and wrote slowly, in the plain, unhurried hand his mother always said was easier to read than his father's had ever been, telling her that he was well, that the hot weather had come on properly now, that the battalion's cricket 11 had a match on Saturday against the gunners which he expected they would lose, since the gunners had a bowler among them who was, by all accounts, wasted on artillery. He told her about Prakash's mangoes, thinking she would like to hear of something so unlike anything in her own kitchen, and about Bishen Singh's 20 years at the washing stone, and found, as he always did once he had actually begun, that the words came easier than the beginning ever promised they would, the pen finding its way down the page while his mind stayed half in this room and half already crossing the sea toward the kitchen he was writing to. He did not mention the heat's full weight, not really, not in any way that would have let her feel it, because there was no describing it to somebody who had never stood inside it, and because, in any case, a letter that dwelt too long on discomfort seemed to him a poor sort of gift to send 4,000 miles, when what she wanted, he was fairly sure, was only to know that he was well, and thought of her, which was true enough to write down without embellishment. The letter took him the better part of an hour, written in the unhurried way a man writes when he has nowhere else to be, and no reason to hurry toward being anywhere else, and when it was done, he sealed it and set it aside to go out with the next post, and lay back down again with nothing further required of him. It was pretty, some while later, dozing on the cot nearest the door, who first caught the sound of it, a bugle call different from the ordinary run of the day's calls, and sat up so fast he startled 2 other men out of their doze along with him. "Mail," he said, with the particular note in his voice that call always produced in every man who heard it, regardless of how many times he had heard it before. "That's mail call, isn't it? Tell me that's mail call." It was mail call, and within a minute the room had come half awake all down its length, men swinging their legs off their cots and pulling shirts straight, because letters from home came by the long sea route and took the better part of 6 weeks to arrive, and a man out here had learned to want them with an intensity that would have seemed excessive, Tom sometimes thought, to anybody who had never spent 6 weeks not knowing whether a letter he had sent had even arrived yet, let alone whether an answer might already be somewhere on the water coming to find him. He walked out to where the orderly room clerk had set up his small table on the veranda with the mail sack open beside him, and stood in the loose queue that had formed there, other men from other rooms drifting up from their own siestas at the same call. The whole cantonment's afternoon stillness broken all at once by this one particular kind of hope. When his name was called, Whitlow T., he stepped up and took the single thin envelope handed to him, his mother's hand on the front of it, familiar as his own, and felt the small sharp lift in his chest that 6 weeks' waiting always produced, no matter how many times the same small miracle repeated itself. He did not open it, standing on the veranda in the glare, because that seemed to him obscurely the wrong way to treat a letter that had come so far to find him. He carried it back to his cot instead, and sat with it a moment unopened, turning it over once, feeling its thinness, before working his thumb carefully under the flap. It was, as her letters generally were, full of small things: the garden, a neighbor's new baby, his younger sister's progress at her needlework, nothing that would have meant anything to a stranger, and everything entirely to Tom, who read it twice through slowly, and then a third time more slowly still, letting the ordinary details of a kitchen 4,000 miles off settle into the ordinary details of the afternoon around him, the punkah's steady sweep, the heat pressing at the shutters, Alf somewhere along the row reading his own letter with the particular fixed concentration he never otherwise gave to anything. When he had finished it, he folded it carefully back along its original creases and put it away in the tin box with the others, a small stack now, 18 months' worth of his mother's hand, kept in order by date, and lay back on the cot with the last of the afternoon slack hours still ahead of him, feeling, for a little while at least, considerably less far from home than the actual distance would have strictly allowed. The heat broke, or rather loosened its grip a little, sometime in the middle of the afternoon, not all at once, but by degrees so gradual that a man only noticed it had happened when he found himself, for the first time in hours, able to think of moving without dread. The shutters were opened back the rest of the way, and a little air came through at last, real air, carrying with it the first hint that the sun had begun its long slide down toward the far side of the Maiden, and along the barrack row men began stirring, sitting up, swinging their legs down, the whole battalion waking together as if some single unheard bell had rung for all of them at once. Tom pulled his boots back on and went out onto the veranda, where the light had softened from its midday glare into something almost gentle, gold rather than white, laying long shadows out across the Maidan from the barrack blocks and the flagstaff and the scattered thorn trees along the parade ground's edge. It was the hour the cantonment gave over to whatever a man cared to make of it, and different men made different things of it. Down toward the far end of the Maidan, a knot of players had already begun knocking a football about in loose, unserious fashion, more for the pleasure of moving after the day's stillness than for any real contest, while nearer the cricket nets a smaller, more earnest group were at work with bat and ball, practicing for Saturday's match with the Gunners, Pretty's opinion on the state of the 11's bowling carrying clearly across the open ground. Tom wandered down that way, not to play, since he had never had much of an eye for the ball himself and knew it, but to watch, leaning on the low fence at the edge of the nets with 2 or 3 other men, similarly disposed to spectate rather than sweat, offering the kind of loud, unhelpful advice that cricket nets the world over seem to invite from men standing safely outside them. The band had begun practicing, too, somewhere behind the officers' mess, the sound of it carrying thin and a little ragged across the intervening ground, a hymn tune Tom half recognized, worked over slowly, phrase by phrase, the same 8 bars repeated until they came out clean, and there was something companionable in hearing it drift across the whole cooling evening, a sound that belonged to no single man's afternoon, but to everybody's at once. He stayed at the nets the better part of an hour, watching Pretty's bowling improve not at all, despite Pretty's own confident assessment that it had. And then, as the gold light began tipping over toward the deeper colors of early evening, drifted back with Alf toward the canteen, where the evening trade was already picking up more men in now than had been there at midday, the mood looser, the talk livelier, somebody at the far table already setting up the tombola board for the evening's game, the numbered discs rattling in their bag with a sound that promised, if nothing else, an hour's harmless entertainment for whoever cared to put down the few paisa card cost. They took a table near the open side of the room where what breeze there was could reach them, and Tom bought a card for the tombola more from habit than any real hope, since he had won it exactly once in 3 years and had long since stopped expecting to win it again, and the game began the way it always began, the caller working through the discs in his flat, unhurried patter, while men bent over their cards with the same fierce private concentration they might have given a far graver matter, marking off numbers, muttering under their breath, groaning good-naturedly when somebody 2 tables over called house before anybody else had managed more than half a line. He did not win this evening either, and did not mind it, and afterward sat over a second mug of the canteen's thin beer while the talk around the table drifted into the easy, shapeless kind that filled these evening hours, a debate about whether the new draft expected out from home next month would strengthen the football 11, a long and largely invented account from one of the older hands about a fish supposedly landed by an officer in another regiment entirely, a fish that grew a little larger, by the older hand's own telling every time the story was told, which nobody at the table quite believed and everybody enjoyed hearing anyway, Alf's own opinion, delivered with total confidence, on which of the 2 regimental barbers gave the better shave, an opinion that directly contradicted Pretty's from dinner, and which neither man seemed troubled to reconcile. The library and reading room stood at the far end of the canteen block, a smaller, quieter room, with a table of newspapers weeks old by the time they reached this far-up country, and a shelf of books gone soft and swollen at the spines from the damp. And Tom looked in on it before the light failed entirely, more from habit than any pressing wish to read, and found 2 or 3 men there in the particular hush the room always kept, one working slowly through a newspaper column by column as though determined to extract every possible fact from it before setting it down, another simply sitting with a book open on his knee and his eyes half closed, more resting than reading. Tom took down a slim volume he had started some weeks before and had not yet finished, an adventure story with a red cloth cover gone pale at the corners, and read a chapter of it in the room's dim evening light before the failing sun made the print too difficult to follow further, and set it back on the shelf, marking his place with a torn scrap of paper for whichever evening he next found his way back to it. Outside, the sky had begun its slow evening change, the gold gone deeper toward orange along the western edge of the Maidan, the heat of the day finally, properly, beginning to loosen its hold, and the whole cantonment seemed to Tom, walking back unhurried toward the barrack lines, to be settling into itself for the night, the way a large, tired animal settles, by degrees, into a comfortable, final stillness. Sunset came a little after the hour. It always came at this time of year, the call rising up thin and clear across the whole cantonment, just as the sky had gone from orange to the deep bruised violet that Tom had never once, in 3 years, managed to see coming until it was already there. Down by the flagstaff, the small ceremony of it was carried out exactly as it was carried out every evening of the year. The flag brought down slowly, hand over hand, while the band, gathered near the base of the staff, played it down with the same unhurried hymn-like tune Tom had heard them rehearsing that very afternoon. The phrase finally come out whole and clean, and every man within sight of the staff who was not actively engaged in something else stood a moment where he was facing that way, still, out of a habit so old in him now, it required no more thought than breathing. He watched it from the barrack veranda with Alf beside him, the two of them saying nothing, and there was something in the sight, the flag sinking slowly against a sky gone the color of a bruise healing, the band's notes carrying thin and true across the cooling Maidan, that Tom had never managed to grow entirely used to, no matter how many 100 times he had now seen it. A small daily ache of something he could not have named, not grief exactly, nor pride exactly, only the plain fact of standing very far from home at the exact hour when a day quietly closed itself. Supper afterward was a lighter meal than dinner had been, bread and a little cold meat left from midday, and more tea, taken without ceremony in the gathering dusk, men drifting to the cookhouse in 2s and 3s now that the day's structure had loosened, and Tom ate sitting on the veranda steps with Alf and Pretty, the talk grown quieter than it had been at midday, the particular unhurried quiet that settles over men when the day's real business, such as it was, has been done, and only the winding down of it remains. The evening brought its own small mercies. The air, properly moving now for the first time since morning, carried the cookhouse smoke away rather than holding it low over the lines, and somewhere off toward the bazaar a string of small lamps had been lit, showing as a scatter of warm gold points against the deepening blue, and the crows had come back to their roost in the trees along the Maidan's edge with a last few minutes of disorganized chatter before falling all at once entirely silent. Tom sat a long while on the steps after his plate was cleared, not thinking of anything in particular, only feeling the day's heat finally leave the stone beneath him, the way it always did once true dark had properly settled in, the whole world cooling by degrees the same way it had heated by degrees that morning, nothing sudden about any of it, only the slow, patient turning of the same wheel that turned every day out here exactly the same way. Lamps were lit along the barrack veranda, small and yellow and steady in the windless evening air, and men drifted back to their cots by 1s and 2s, some to write the letters they had put off since afternoon, some simply to lie and talk low in the dark the way men do at the true end of a day, no particular subject required, only the comfort of a familiar voice nearby. Tom checked his kit once more out of pure habit, more ritual now than necessity, buttons already bright, boots already blacked, rifle already racked and clean and asking nothing further of him, and lay down at last on his own cot, with the net let down around him against the mosquitoes that the cooling evening always brought out in their thin, whining numbers. The last bugle of the day came some while later, after most of the room had already gone quiet, a slow-falling call that Tom had heard so many 100 times now that it no longer struck him as music at all, but simply as the sound of a day being folded closed, gentle, unhurried, entirely without urgency, the way a hand might draw a curtain across a window at the end of a long, fair afternoon. Somewhere further off, another bugler answered it, fainter, from the direction of the far lines, the same notes handed on and on across the sleeping cantonment until the whole station had been told, in the one language every man in it understood without needing to think about it, that the day, such as it had been, was finished now, and nothing further would be asked of anyone until the Rouse called them up again into tomorrow's identical, undemanding light. Tom lay listening to it fade, one hand resting loose on his chest, the net's fine mesh softening the last lamp's glow into something the color of weak tea, and felt beneath him the cot's canvas still faintly warm from the day just past, though cooling now, minute by minute, the way everything out here cooled once the sun had finally consented to let the ground go. Along the row, a man coughed once and settled. Somewhere outside, a nightjar called twice, and then did not call again. Alf's breathing beside him had already gone slow and even, and Tom, listening to it, and to the small settling creaks of the whole long room giving up its heat into the dark, felt his own thoughts loosen and slow and let go of themselves one by one, the ordinary day closing over him exactly the way it always did, gently, completely.